Hello. Cars being loud in the background. I apologize. I thought I would make a brief video here talking about a little bit more about techniques, or rather, why when it comes to feeling better and manifesting a better life, we have to ultimately get beyond just a certain technique and make sure that whatever we're applying, whatever tool we're using, whatever technique we are implementing directly affects us in a personal way. Real transformation happens by being deeply affected personally. It can't just be a superficial tool or technique if we're looking to deeply transform. At least, the vast majority of the time. And I heard I was talking to a guy a few months ago, and he paraphrased this great Terence McKenna quote, which I had never heard before and I loved. Terence McKenna, if you don't know him, very famous for his psychedelic research and talking about psychedelics. And he's got this great quote that I thought I would read today. I'll link below to the longer interview that this is from. Sorry, I've got my Chromebook open where the quote is. This is in regards to techniques, okay? Especially he says New Age here, but New Age we can put under that New Age umbrella certainly manifesting techniques, right? And it's not about necessarily agreeing with what he says here completely. I don't agree with what he says here completely, but just listening to what he's saying, because some of what he's saying here I think will resonate with you. Anyway, McKenna says in this interview, he said, what you could safely say about the New Age, if a technique doesn't work, they'll proclaim it. I'm very much in favor of anything which breaks down the conceptions of ordinary medical practice. That's the most important part of the New Age, the attack on the medical fascism of the hierarchy. But people confuse science with reason and think that if you're anti-science, then you're somehow just permitted to go bananas. No, you can be anti-science, but nobody gets released from stuff like the rules of evidence. You have to make sense. Great quote. And, a few things stand out for me in regards to what he's talking about. I think it's really unfortunate and just the taboo truth, especially with what we see online where people do just go bananas when talking about these manifesting ideas and talking about the law of attraction and the law of assumption. You really see that if a technique generally does not work for most people, they'll proclaim it as always working or being true or being a law. I mean, it would be hilarious. I mean, it is hilarious, but it would be funnier, much more funny, if it wasn't so pathetic and if it didn't hurt so many people. When I talk about spiritual bypassing, when it comes to this stuff, this is what happens. These techniques that are very subjective and that work for some people, but not the vast majority of people who try them. Even if they're trying to implement them in a very, genuine way. They're legitimately trying. For instance, people are legitimately trying to implement Neville's advice, his SATS advice, and are unable to, right? Or just persisting in the way that Neville talks about, and are unable to persist in such a way. And yet you see Neville coaches, law of assumption coaches all the time being you just have to persist, you just have to do SATs, or you just have to do this imaginative method, you just have to live in the end. It's really that easy. They're proclaiming from the rooftops this technique that does not fucking work for most people. And so this confuses us. It would be hilarious if it didn't confuse people and fuck them up because they're what am I doing wrong? This technique works for people. It doesn't work for me. And what they don't realize, what they don't recognize, understandably because of how it's presented, which is poorly, is that the technique does not actually work for most people. And so they get screwed up. They either beat themselves up, or they give up on all these manifesting ideas, or they just assume they're doing something wrong, or they have a little bit of success with the technique and think that's all there is to this manifesting stuff when there's so much more. That's the problem with, relying on techniques and relying on these, manifesting gurus to say, you just do this one thing. One thing you can say for sure about manifesting techniques is if they don't work, you'll have people online saying they do work perfectly every time. That shit drives me crazy as a coach and counselor. And as someone who wants to help you utilize whatever tool or technique might work for you, but certainly might not work for you, who wants to explore these ideas, which I do believe work for everybody in some degree, and which you're utilizing anyway. You're manifesting your life whether you like it or not. I don't want you to be put in the box by saying you have to do this certain technique. You have to do it this certain way. Because all you really have to do is what you're doing already, which is doing you. You want to do you better. That's what you would like on a practical level, is to feel better, to have better things in your life. And you already know how to do that in some way. And the idea is to find tools to help you bring out and do it better, to feel better. But there's no one set way. And if you really get into this stuff, you realize, my gosh, well, Neville's techniques, a lot of the techniques he talks about, and I'll put a link above, again, to a mini course that did all about Neville's techniques. I love Neville's techniques. But we're being foolish and insane if we're saying that they work for everybody. And there's so many other options. And if you get into, the history of a lot of these manifesting ideas, you realize there are so many other options. And that you shouldn't be limited by just trying to do law of assumption techniques or the stuff that Abraham Hicks talks about or whatever else is popular. So many different options. If you listen to my podcast, we're going over all these different, techniques that different teachers are talking about, but they're all pretty much pointing to the same thing. So there's so many different techniques you can try. Because ultimately, they're all just pointing at improving you, making you feel better, and hopefully manifesting better things in your external reality as well. But you're the person who does that, not the technique. So I thought that was worth remembering. And, this is so true. What McKenna says, just because, you're against, a lot of traditional science, which tends to be very in the box. And by the way, I'm not against a lot of traditional science. I think it's extremely helpful. Right? But if you're against, but there's plenty of things which I think are way too in the box, especially when it comes to psychology, right? A good example is why people don't talk about Emile Coué anymore, even though Coué basically showed how effective a lot of this imaginative work could be. But, McKenna's saying here, just because you are leery of science doesn't mean you're permitted to go bananas, to use his words. If the stuff that you're talking about doesn't make sense, it's not going to work for most people. You know what I mean? If you do a technique and it doesn't make sense, or you're talking about a technique and it doesn't make sense, you're not going to be able to consistently do it. Because when you start thinking about it, you're like, wait, this doesn't actually make sense. Maybe it works for you some of the time, but you're not going to be able to explain it to other people and expect them to actually get results consistently. The more sense we can make, the better usually. Again, that's why Coué was such an effective teacher of these ideas, is he was able to show that, he would run people through these exercises. I'll put a link above to the exercises he ran people through to get them confident that it really was their imagination that was running the show for the most part, and that their willpower was no match for their imagination if the two weren't in accord. And once he showed people, gave them evidence of that, for instance, by having them hold their hands together and saying, I can't open my hands, I can't open my hands, I can't open my hands. And then Coué telling them to open their hands when they're still thinking they couldn't open their hands, and then being unable to open their hands, even though Coué told them to open their hands, by giving them evidence and showing them many examples of stuff like that happening, of the imagination dominating their willpower. he was able to help them believe that this stuff works, and hence it did work for them. So generally speaking, the more sense we can make out of these ideas, even the far out manifesting teachers like Neville or Joel Goldsmith, as far out as they might sound, the more sense that they make, the more effective their advice is going to be for us in all likelihood. That's why I personally definitely prefer Neville's earlier advice and like his advice from 5 lessons, which again we go over in that course about his various techniques. I greatly prefer that advice of Neville's than his later, advice from the 1960s after the promise. Because for me, his earlier advice from like the 1940s makes a lot more sense to me. Now you're different. The later stuff might make more sense to you, might be deeper, and have more power for you than the earlier stuff. But whatever technique you're using, whatever approach you're using, you want it to make sense. The reason Abraham Hicks is so effective for some people is it makes sense to them. I had Melissa Basie on last year or whatever it was, and she had this great line. She said, when she first heard Abraham Hicks, she was like, who is this great, Esther Hicks, she was like, who is this great psychologist? And Basie's a psychologist. So, you know what I'm saying? Like, it made sense to her, even though she was, Esther uses terms like vortex and all this stuff. It still made sense. The more sense the technique makes the more sense the technique makes, the better it's going to be for you probably. All right. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or if you'd like coaching, I can be reached at radicalcounselor.com.